I want to thank Mitchell scholars Michelle Miles, Aaron Rhoda, and Victoria Kelly for their contributions to this podcast. My guest today is poet and Stanford professor Eavan Boland. When you were young and decided you wanted to be a poet, well, did you decide you wanted to be a poet when you were young? And when you told your parents this, did they ask, how are you going to support yourself?
When I think about being a poet, I think of a wonderful thing an American poet, William Stafford, once said. Somebody got up in the audience at a reading that he gave and said, "When did you start being a poet?" And he said to them, "When did you stop?" So, I think the idea that there's a continuum from when you're young. I was a child who wrote poems for people's birthdays and things like that. I would always say, I've said it in so many workshops, there's a huge difference for everybody between writing poems and being a poet. And how you make that transition is a very personal, very important part of, who you are as a writer. And it can never come from an external source. I mean, you can't become a poet because you get published or something. It's got to be some internal sense of real decision. And I would say that I wrote poems in my early 20s, but it was much later, in my later 20s, that I could just really say to myself, I am a poet. I think a poet isn't something you do, it's what you are. And I think for you to really get to that point, I got to it more slowly than I thought I would. And I would certainly, understand if anybody else said that, because you write poems and you're surrounded, as I was as a student at Trinity College, by a very literary city. In a sense, it's kind of imitative behavior. Other people are writing them. Later, you have to make that last sort of step to being a poet, not just to writing poems.
And where does it come in? Did you think at some stage, I have to have a day job? And even though I'm a poet, I can't make a living at this? Or when did you realize you could make a living? You could subsist on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Ireland that discussion happened less. I mean, nobody in the arts made a living in Ireland when I was young.
Right.
The actors didn't, the poets didn't,
right.
The novelists didn't. So that discussion didn't come up really. What did come up, I think, was where would this fit in your life? I mean, where would this go with your life? I mean, anytime I sat down beside an actor, I always thought there was someone worse off than a poet. I mean, actors are always looking for work in Ireland, but I don't think I thought of it as a profitable or unprofitable thing. And yet, there's a triptych in Ireland, I think, someone once, triad, where someone told me this in the Irish language, and it says, the three worst things that can happen. I think it's a cow that has a fever, a harvest that fails, a child that is a poet. And, so there's a recognition that it's not a practical thing to do. My mother thought it was a very natural thing to do. And I think my father was much more uneasy about it.
How you were going to pay the rent? Because when you were saying about acting, it reminds me, I'm trying to think of who it is. It's a theater director who said of actors, if you have a backup plan, you'll probably use it. Yeah, so you won't actually be an actor.
Yes.
So at some stage you have to decide.
Well, early on, I knew one thing because it came to me. I was appointed to the staff of Trinity when I was about 23. I was a junior lecturer, which would now be an assistant professor. I certainly knew I was a teaching poet.
You also said that in small countries with powerful histories, we learn to evade the truth by decorating it. I had a conversation with someone Irish about the perpetuation of myths known to be false, and I asked why that was done, and he told me because it's what we want to believe about ourselves. Could you talk a bit about the decorating of the truth and what truths you were referring to?
Well, I think, of course, now, from this standpoint in Ireland, we decorated a number of truths that are extraordinarily painful to look back on. The Ireland that, the extraordinary achievement and experience of a small country that came into its own after hundreds of years of oppression, in a way became the most decorated of all truths. I mean, it became a story of heroes. And under that sort of rubric of sort of glory, we overlooked what was done to women. We overlooked the extraordinary pain that young families and young women and children and older young men suffered in the Catholic Church. The truth we decorated was of the inevitable destiny of a small country that through courage and ingenuity and dedication had achieved statehood. But that was an insufficient truth, and I think we used it to exempt ourselves from a certain self-scrutiny. And that, to me, is the decorated truth.
Do you think that scrutiny is happening now?
Yes, and I think, I would have to pay tribute to many, many people in Ireland who have told the truth and told it with tremendous courage, including, I would have to say, very recently, our Prime Minister, Taoiseach.
Right. Yes.
In difficult circumstances against the trend of our inheritance. And I admire that, and I admire what has happened in Ireland over the last couple of decades. People have been much, much more inclined to tell the truth.
And so what do you think then, because a lot of this has come into the discussion about Martin McGuinness now running for president. Somebody wrote this week, somebody in the Irish Times, I think it was Fenton, who wrote, we don't want to go that far.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a person of a certain kind of political. I mean, I would basically believe on paper that people should come into the democratic process and that they should submit themselves to the people's will, and that almost always there is a safety in that. I don't want to take anything away from Mr. McGuinness, but he did have another history, and the history is an unsettling one, I think, for people. And probably we haven't quite got to the point of thinking that one democratic process offsets another history. That's a very, offhand remark. I am.
But it'll be interesting too to see with younger people who, if you're in your 20s, you don't even remember any of it. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Martin McGuinness can take his narrative to the people, and to me, whenever that happens, I am always more inclined to think it's a good thing than a bad thing.
Right. You said that if a poet does not tell the truth about time, his or her work will not survive it. What truths do you believe need unearthing in contemporary Ireland? And which young poets, do you see who might be doing that? Do you think there's anything left to uncover?
Yeah, I do, and I think there always will be. I mean, I wouldn't have the immediate names, but I do, and I think a lot of other writers in Ireland do, really look forward to the Nigerian-Irish poet who is coming our way. I hugely look forward to the Croatian-Irish poet. These people are going to bring such an extraordinary voice from what they have lost to what we have lost. And so, to me, that's our future.
What you've said just makes me jump ahead to something I was going to ask you later. But, now that you spend this much time in the U.S. and Ireland, and what impact does that have on you in terms of identity? Do you think you're Irish? Do you think you're American? Is there such a thing? Are you just a poet, or are you an Irish poet or an American poet?
I'm entirely an Irish poet. I think that you have an origin. Your origin doesn't change when your destination changes. It just doesn't. And my formation is as an Irish poet. In many ways, I'm a straight-up lyric poet, a European lyric poet. But I went to school in New York as a child. I've always had a great love for the United States, and it's had a remarkable poetry. And I do think we live in an era when we're fortunate as writers that we can join the conversation physically, not just intellectually. We can actually be in the place where that conversation is happening. This has a very wonderful creative writing program at Stanford. There is a wonderful conversation. When I go back to Ireland, of course, the conversation I hear is the Irish conversation, and probably that's the one I will always hear. I'm an Irish poet. Nothing pleases me and nothing annoys me as much as the Irish idiom. But in how I think of myself in my mind, I think of myself as entirely an Irish poet who has been fortunate enough to be able to converse with other poetry.
There was a recent interview on the Guardian website with Colm Tóibín, and he said that during the boom years, people would say to him, "Where's your boom novel? Do you get where's your boom poem? Where's your crash poem?" Do you ever think in those terms, or do other people put that to you at all?
Yeah, I think people expect their writers to be relevant in a certain way. And I think most writers, and I'm sure Colin would have there, resist that idea. The relevance that writing has isn't simply, it's not a relevance to documenting the event. It's an element, it's a relevance to the processes that everybody lives in and everybody goes through. But I do think the Irish, by and large, care profoundly about their writers. I mean, and not always in the most constructive way, but I think they're close to the idea that language has agency in Ireland.
Going on right now, Ireland's gone obviously from one extreme to another and back again in the last 20 years. There's a lot of talk now about this sort of elevating the arts again, and the arts will save us. And do you have any view on that whole conversation?
Well, it would be very wrong to me. I mean, other people would probably have another view. Very wrong to say the arts could save us when people can't pay their mortgages. They can't, people are struggling so hard. Jobs are lost in small towns. People have lost their homes. But I do think that when I was there, especially now in the last 2 or 3 months, there's an extraordinary level of community restored because the Irish have that dialect of hardship. They do know that. And they really have that terrific spirit. And I think I wouldn't wish any hardship on anyone, but they probably speak that dialect better than the one of buying the second Bulgarian house, which I don't think ever quite suited them. But I think that they understand, that what is there in community is essentially a tremendous Irish excellence. It really is. And it's something the Irish have, their great spirit and their extraordinary resilience. I mean, I was not surprised to see this poll. I don't know how specious it was, of all the happy nations in the Irish were extraordinarily happy. And it didn't surprise me in the least. It's very like who the Irish are. And so I think they've struggled and been hit hard, but there's a very palpable resilience in the country.
There's another quote that you said where you said that we live, and this maybe you wrote this in the boom, but you said we live in a very uncaretaking age. The inventory of what is lost is much larger than what is kept. Were you thinking about people, places, things?
I was certainly thinking of the fact, I think, that during the boom, I think the thing that would have worried me most is a culture of prosperity was being commended that in some ways, I don't think anyone intended this directly, but it could have encouraged people to disown a past in which they often were. There was hardship and powerlessness. And so there was this concept of the new prosperity as a kind of power. And the fact that we had once been powerless was better forgotten. I thought that was a terrible disowning of many of the non-visible things that made Ireland great. And not only that, but that it was an extraordinarily bad example to our young people. To lose that memory and to lose the value system that we put on that memory was the most ungiving thing we could do. I mean, and I think that people apprehend that now much better than they did then.
What is your sense of the global perception of Ireland these days? And is there a danger of the country becoming trapped in a kind of over-sentimentalized objecthood?
Well, it's always had that danger. I think there's always been a danger that Ireland will become a simplification of itself. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It lends itself, as you said, to mythology. It sort of elevates itself. You can go back to the 60s and see articles in Time magazine which are extraordinarily praising of Ireland at a time when the most terrible things were happening on the island unchallenged. So I think it has always lended itself to that. But I don't think there's any society now that will not be self-questioning. I think an awful lot of what has happened has broken through a huge amount of legends and myths and everything. And I think voices of self-scrutiny will now be much more welcomed than they once were.
You've kindly given us permission to use your poem that the science of cartography is limited to teach 16-year-olds about the famine. What would you hope that someone of that age, or any age, might take away from that poem?
Probably a couple of things. First of all, that in history, I mean, these people, the sheer historical fact that these people lived in a time when they had such no defenses, not only against the natural catastrophe of famine, but against the laissez-faire economics of England, which brought people over and made them work for food when they had no strength to work. I've seen the Famine Roads, as many other people have, especially in Mayo and Meath, where you look down in the woods and you see these tragic roads that people were assigned to build when they were dying of starvation and typhus, and where the road ends is just where they died making it. I'd want them certainly to always remember that human history of people caught, but I'd also want them to remember two things. A, those roads don't show up on any map. And B, that I as a poet could go back and amend that. That language does have power. That, you could return to that scene and say, wait, this isn't written, so I'm going to write it so that the individual artist does have that sort of power to say, I'm not going to leave this incomplete. I do have the chance through language and art to amend it. And the poem is really intended for that.
And you've returned to the subject of Famine Roads on more than one occasion in your poetry. Do you ever find that it just saps you of your energy? Do you ever look at it and say, I don't want to write about that again. It's too hard.
Well, I wouldn't probably
Emotionally,
write much about it now. At the time, I was like a lot of people. I mean, I was very aware of where the famine placed itself in the history of Ireland in 47. There was very little commemoration of the famine. The famine as an event of powerlessness and what people could call passivity was not attractive to a national myth built on heroes. And so there was a chance that it would be overlooked. And it's just like in 1848, there's extraordinarily little writing about the famine done by Irish writers at the time. There's The Nation, which is a national newspaper, in 1848 publishes article after article about national triumph and nothing about the famine. So these extraordinarily powerful paradigms of shame and loss and powerlessness sit at they are ghosts at the center of a national consciousness, and they haunt it. And it was the haunting, that I was conscious of. And as a young woman, I think I went around Lord Leitrim's estate where they had, I came from a middle-class background. I was lucky in my parents. But I remember walking around this estate and being shown around it. It was a tour. And how in the driving rain, the men who came to pay their rents at the time of the famine were not allowed to put their caps on and had to stand there in that drenching rain. And I remember feeling such anger at the inhumanity, even though it was small on the list of the many inhumanities. So I think I thought of it as a past which was strangely present. And to me, it lived in some way.
In your memoir, Object Lessons, you wrote, "It seemed I had a choice. I could write my life into the Irish poem in the way tradition dictated, as mythic distaff of the national tradition, or I could confront the fact that in order to write the Irish poem, I would have to alter for myself the powerful relations between subject and object which were established there. That in turn involved disrupting the other values encoded in those relations, the authority of the poet. In its place, the historic legend, and the allegory of the nationhood which had customarily been shadowed and enmeshed in the image of the woman. You came of age in Dublin in the 50s and 60s, a contemporary of Heaney, Longley, and Mahon. Your love of traditional Irish poetry, Yeats for example, conflicted with the increasingly unbearable fashion in which that same verse objectified women, mythically yoked to conceptions of the Irish nation. You led the way in encouraging Irish women to discard that objecthood and occupy the place of the subject. Can you talk a bit about what you faced in those years as you worked to chart your own course, and what your relationship was with your male contemporaries?
Well, and Adrienne Rich has this great line in Diving into the Wreck, the book of myths in which our names do not appear. I certainly felt that in the Irish poem, as a book of myths, our names did not appear. Irish women were certainly the objects of that poem. And I would still believe what I said then, that the sort of adventure of my generation, I think, was that Irish women went from being the objects of the Irish poem to being the authors of the Irish poem, and that it was a disruptive transit. I think the male contemporaries, many of them whose work I had a great personal regard for, they had a difficult time with some of that, and I understood that. I didn't think that we were probably at that point going to get to the level of dialogue, and I'm not sure we did. But in my view, it was a simple, nobody owns a national tradition. Nobody owns a national poem. Nobody needs to sue at the gates of their own country for admission to its history and its culture. And I was absolutely clear that I wasn't going to do that. I didn't personalize it too much because I felt that, it was about the ordained structure of a literature. People in a society that had truly, as we now know, devalued the experience of women. It was very hard to believe for people that a woman feeding a child at midnight, or a woman shopping, or a woman in her house could be as appropriate a subject for the Irish poem as the canonical subjects had been. So I thought that, there were those difficulties. And for me, what did I think? I probably thought at the time when I sort of, I had moments perhaps of frustration, but I also thought it was a great opportunity to make a case that went beyond Irish poetry, that made a case for the fact that a nation without the voice and vision of women is going to perish. It is not going to have a literature that is balanced. I think we look back now and we know that argument made its way almost inevitably. I think times changed. I think they didn't change because of me or anyone else. I think there was a broadening view of what Ireland was, a recognition that certain conservatisms had not served it well.
Right.
It is a country that has lent to sexism and chauvinism in ways that might have impacted slightly on me, but impacted profoundly on the most vulnerable women. And for that, they should hang their heads in shame. And so I was very unrepentant about all of that, and I'm especially unrepentant about the fact that although there are distinguished male journalists who might well have some questions about people like myself, I never heard them raise their voice against the 1974 marriage ban, which was turned over by the European, where a woman lost her job when she got married in universities. And people from other countries say, what? This barbaric piece of legislation. We had members, Chop the Dollar, on their feet, complaining about South Africa, in the middle of barbaric legislation against their own citizens. And that when I joined the women's movement, I was a young woman. That sort of was wrong. However, Ireland had to always make its way to the light through revisions and discussions. A lot of people, I think, do think differently now. What saddens me is really not for artists who have a comeback. It's for people caught in those terrible climates who absolutely had no defenses. And it is terrible to look back on that and think how repressive that was.
You spoke there about the women's movement in Ireland. What do you find now?
because of the Mitchell Scholarship,
Yes.
would deal regularly with a whole new set of 23-year-olds every year.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, and I've watched them over, in different periods, and feminism becomes a dirty word.
Absolutely.
How do you find it
Well,
today when you talk about issues like that?
I am very understanding. I do think feminism is a word of derogation. I'm absolutely feminist. It's not. I take a feminist view, but I also believe it's entirely free for people to decide. The one thing young women must be very careful of is they mustn't be anti-feminist until someone does something wrong to them, and then they become feminist. That's a very empirical way of doing it. So I think that feminism's had a commitment to the idea that somebody who is excluded on the grounds of gender, that it doesn't injure gender, it injures a whole society. Over and over again, you had to put forward these things with people branding them as, dangerous, unbalanced stuff. And, eventually, of course, we signed the Maastricht Treaty, and that was the end of all of that. And Europe fined the Irish government over and over again. And I would like to pay tribute, I really would, to the Irish politicians of the day, because they were always more progressive. I spoke to many of those, and many of those politicians knew a change was coming. They were in their constituencies. They knew it had to come. But there remained a strong middle-class investment in the Ireland of comely maidens, as De Valera put it, and the belief that people in the women's movement were doing terrible things, and the women saying, I never felt the need for liberation. Fine. And we were existing, women couldn't sign a hire purchase agreement there. Anyway, so, every single year the trade union movement, God bless them, with their conveners, went in solemnly to vote for less money for women. What was that? So anyway, we lived under this rubric, and young women now, I think, simply don't see that. They don't identify that. And they see feminism as prejudicial. It was a struggle for legislative and economic equality at times. It remains a crucial one in other countries in the East, in the very complicated elements of feminism come into the discussion of women and the burqa. Women and the, I personally was outraged that they were to be stopped wearing burqas. It's a complex idea that feminism comes to consider the traditional rights of people and their the issues of faith and dignity of women, even in circumstances that you're not very comfortable with. We have a big Yemeni population in Dublin.
Right.
Women wear the full burqa and the black gloves, and it's a very, very key question about, whether they should wear it, whether they should not wear it. We had generations of nuns who wore headdresses. We need to think, and we need to converse about it, and we need to think, and young women who think that feminism doesn't matter need to look at the societies that are there, that are deeply complex, in which women and women's rights are key issues. I'm very, very glad all my life. I've been a very committed feminist. I'm not a feminist poet. If I had been a Marxist, I wouldn't have been a Marxist poet. Isms don't work well in poetry.
Right.
You also wrote, the way to the past is never smooth. For a woman poet, it can be especially torturous. Every step towards an origin is also an advance towards a silence. You make much of the fact that the stories of Irish women, even up to your own generation, have been largely lost to history. You had no female artistic predecessor in Ireland as an example. Women who have come after you have you as an example. What do you perceive as the contemporary challenges facing Irish women poets, and how do you feel your work has potentially altered their aesthetic and personal developments?
Well, that's always a very difficult thing to say. There's only one way in which one poet of one generation affects the next, or the generation after it. And it goes right across gender and nationality. It's whether that work gives them a permission to do something they want to do. You always would hope that your work, I've said 100 times that when I was young, it was much easier to have a political murder in an Irish poem than a washing machine, and it was. And I hope that the person who wants to write about the washing machine can do so more easily. But I think it's very elusive. I mean, I would have felt a lot of permission, not from Women for Bear, but from a poet like Patrick Kavanagh, who had a very deep, powerful, and unhierarchical personality in his work. So you hope that young women writers have an increasing permission to write, and that they don't have to make false choices. But you could never be certain of that. You could never gauge that.
A Mitchell scholar who studied creative writing at Trinity told me that she noticed how accessible Ireland's artistic community is, especially to new and young writers, and it seemed to her that there wasn't really an intimidating barrier between well-known writers and the general public that she feels is more often the case in the U.S., and she wondered if you'd noticed that.
Well, I think Irish writing, for good and ill, is a turbulent and friendly community. It's certainly. I don't think she's going to find any hierarchy. Nobody has any. And I think there probably is more hierarchy, protocol, and decorum in the American literary world. I think writers of great stature are probably less approachable. Mm. But although I think there's a lot of friendliness and generosity, but of a different kind.
Right.
Ireland is, as you know, friendly, turbulent, and malicious as well. And so I think Dublin is an incredibly, charming, toxic. And that's why when you ask, am I an Irish poet, you only live in one place ever. I was a young writer in Ireland. There is no other experience that ever, could be the same. Yeah. However annoyed you are, it will always be that.
You wrote, "Safety is not a place, but a language." You write in English, not Irish. Is there safety in the English language for Irish poets, or is English, the language itself, an act of colonization, not rather another means of imprisoning Irish subjecthood?
Well, it's a very key question. It's a very important question. I have a very decided view on it, and I think there are a lot of other views on other sides that are very compelling as well. I really believe that when we try to calibrate why this little island produced this tremendous literature, to me there is no doubt that the reason it happened is because in the 19th century, every indignity and humiliation and grief that came to the Irish people came in the English language. The bailiff's writ, the bailiff's voice, the criminal court, the garrison, all of that. For Irish writers to take that language in the 20th century and make it tell the Irish story, make it do the work of Irish self-determination, was a great narrative in itself. And, Yeats gave us this great speech in London in 1928. He's asked by the Indian writers, he says, "Irish is my native language, but it is not my mother tongue." And I think in having English as our mother tongue, we took the fracture that had happened and made it do the work of healing the country. And so I'm absolutely committed on that side. I have huge respect for Nuala Nic Onall and the Irish language writers. They have a different story, but I think Nuala would be open to some of that too.
You also wrote, "My grandmother lived outside history, and she died there. What troubled me increasingly was not whether she had included the nation in her short life, but whether that nation had included her." Who lives outside history in contemporary Ireland? And what might your poems/feminism have to offer the immigrant community, for example, or somebody else?
Well, the only thing that I think you can never presume that anything you write offers anything to anyone, but when I wrote, questioned the relation between somebody like myself and a very powerful national myth. I think many immigrant writers, in both what they lose and what they gain, stand outside history. They stand on the margin. And I believe then and now that the center does not define the margin. It always happens that the margin defines the center. And the immigrant writer will be that margin who defines the center. So in the sense that I made those arguments, perhaps I might help to think of themselves in that transit from margin to center.
And finally, what would you say to encourage more people to enjoy or write poetry? And how do we as a society foster appreciation? Because now it's all obviously, which is good, not bad, about math and science. And how can we make it relevant? And what do you say to those people who just think it's so outside their ability to understand? Or what do you say to that person who thinks, this is not for me?
So it always has interested me, that when Beethoven, I think he was losing his hearing, and he wrote on top of the Second Symphony, from the heart to the heart. And I really believe that people have a great ability to comprehend poems. And I also believe that astonishing numbers of people keep one poem close to them, keep some line of a poem in their hearts, keep something there. They should know that they can keep that. They don't have to analyze it. They don't have to be academic about it, but it stays with them. It's a companion to them. It comes to the edges of their weddings and christenings, and it's a great companion spirit, lines of poetry that summarize something. I think an enormous number of people have that. And I think that, the audience of poetry is usually vertical, not horizontal. I think people read it over time, remember it over time, keep it in their hearts. And, I don't think that will ever change. I really don't.
Thank you.
You're welcome.